My name is Elena Hayes. I'm 42 now, and if you asked anyone in Chicago who I am, they'd probably call me a successful entrepreneur, maybe even a pioneer. But if you'd asked me 10 years ago who I was, I would have said a wife, a partner, a believer in shared dreams. Back then, I thought trust was the foundation of everything. I learned how wrong I was in a glass-walled conference room in Manhattan on a bright spring morning in the early 2010s. The place smelled of polished oak and ambition. Journalists leaned forward with their recorders, investors sat in sleek suits, and cameras clicked with hungry anticipation. It was supposed to be the unveiling of the medical device I had poured my soul into. Late nights sketching blueprints at my kitchen table, hours soldering parts that stained my hands with chemicals, endless testing until my eyes burned. This was my work, our work, I had thought. When the patent name was revealed on the screen, I held my breath, waiting to see it, Hayes. But only two names glowed under the lights. Daniel Harrington. Victor Chun. My name was gone. Erased. There was a beat of silence where my chest seemed to collapse in on itself, followed by a swell of applause that sounded muffled and far away. I turned my head toward Daniel, my husband, the man who had promised me forever, and he gave me a small smile. Not guilt, not apology, just smooth calculation. Under the table, he slid his hand onto mine, squeezing it with practiced reassurance. "It's better this way," he whispered, his voice so low it barely touched the air. "Trust me. Trust him." The words cut sharper than the omission itself. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as paper, and forced my lips into a smile for the benefit of the crowd. My palms trembled beneath the table, but outwardly I clapped along with everyone else, as though I were just another impressed spectator. All the while, Victor's smug glance swept past me, not even lingering long enough to acknowledge I existed. The cameras flashed, capturing the two men as if they were titans of innovation. No one looked at me. Not a single lens turned in my direction. It was as if I had been airbrushed from my own life's portrait. Inside, my stomach twisted into knots so tight, I thought I might unravel completely. But I didn't move. I didn't cry. I didn't storm out or scream. I sat there, smiling, my nails pressing crescents into my palms, determined not to give them a single frame of my brokenness. And that was the beginning. The first crack that split open everything I thought I knew about loyalty, love, and partnership. Now, I know some of you watching this are leaning in because you've seen polished highlight reels of success stories, slick magazine covers, smiling couples on glossy pages. But the real story? The messy part nobody shows you? That's what you're hearing now. And if you want more of these truths, the kind whispered behind closed doors, you'll want to subscribe. Because this story, it's only just getting started. Back then, though, I only knew one thing. My life had changed forever. As I sat in that glittering conference room, clapping for the men who had stolen my work, I told myself it had to be some kind of mistake, a temporary slight, a misunderstanding that would be cleared later. But deep down, a colder truth took root. I had been erased deliberately, and Daniel wanted me to accept it as kindness. Looking back now, I see that moment for what it truly was, the pivot of my life. The hour I stopped being a partner and became a ghost in my own creation. That was the day I learned betrayal doesn't always shout. Sometimes it smiles in a tailored suit and says it's for your own good. I didn't come from money. I came from a 2-bedroom house in Quincy, just outside of Boston. My mother was a nurse who worked double shifts to keep the lights on, and my father was a mechanic with hands permanently stained by grease and oil. They didn't have much to give me in terms of luxury, but what they gave me was grit and an almost stubborn belief that problems could be fixed if you rolled up your sleeves and figured out how things worked. I grew up tinkering. Old radios, busted microwaves, anything abandoned on the curb. I'd take them apart and scatter their guts across the kitchen table, tracing wires with my fingers, sketching diagrams on scrap paper. My parents would sigh when they came home to another mess, but they never stopped me. Mom said, "Elena, you've got the kind of mind that sees what could be, not just what is." That belief carried me further than anyone expected. I became the first in my family to graduate from college, and not just any college, MIT. I remember standing on the campus lawn that first fall, surrounded by students who looked as if they'd been groomed for brilliance since birth, and feeling both terrified and determined. I didn't have their polish, their prep schools, their money, but I had the hunger. It was at a networking event during my second year that I met Daniel. He was everything I wasn't. Old money charm from Manhattan, crisp suits that looked tailored even when they weren't, and a smile that made people lean in closer. He told me he admired my drive, that I was refreshingly real, in a sea of pretentious climbers. I was 20, flattered, and naive enough to believe every word. By the time I graduated, we were inseparable. To me, our marriage felt like the perfect balance, my ideas and work ethic, his connections and polish. He gave me access to rooms I never would have walked into alone. I gave him a sense of groundedness he claimed to crave. It was intoxicating, the merging of two worlds. Then there was Victor. He and Daniel had known each other since prep school, the kind of bond formed on ivy-covered campuses and exclusive retreats. At first, Victor was charming in the same way Daniel was, smooth, articulate, quick with a compliment. He shook my hand the first time we met and said, "Daniel's told me you're the brains of this operation." I smiled, thinking it was a compliment. Later, I realized he meant it as a joke. The slights came slowly, too subtle to call out without looking paranoid. At meetings, he'd dismiss my designs as too theoretical. When I offered suggestions, he'd redirect with, "That's an interesting thought, Elena, but let's focus on what's practical." Practical, of course, meant his ideas. Daniel always smoothed it over. Don't take it personally. He just pushes people hard. And I convinced myself not to overreact. Meanwhile, I was the one soldering wires in a cramped kitchen, the hum of old appliances competing with my late-night brainstorming sessions. My notebooks filled with sketches, equations, iterations of what would eventually become the prototype that changed everything. I believed, truly believed, that we were building something together. In those days, I saw my exhaustion as noble, like all great innovators must suffer through sleepless nights and burned fingers to bring an idea to life. And when Daniel kissed my forehead after another all-nighter and said, "You're brilliant, Elena. We're going to change the world," I believed him. Looking back now, I can see the cracks forming even then. Victor's smirk when I spoke too passionately, Daniel's careful assurances whenever I pushed too hard for recognition. But at the time, I told myself that was just partnership, give and take, compromise, trust. Trust. That word again. It was the air I breathed in my 30s, blind to the fact that the people closest to me were already learning how to choke me with it. For a while, I still believed I had a place. The early days after the prototype took shape were heady, meetings with potential investors, dinners where Daniel raised a glass to our future, and late-night phone calls from Victor about next steps. I sat at the table with them in those first weeks, scribbling notes, pitching refinements, explaining the science in plain English so investors could understand. They leaned on me, or so I thought. But then the invitation slowed. At first, Daniel told me the meetings were just preliminary, nothing worth my time. "You've done the heavy lifting, Elena," he'd say, brushing my cheek with the back of his hand. "Let us handle the boring business side. You don't need to burn yourself out." It sounded protective, loving even, and I wanted to believe that's what it was. Soon, presentations happened without me. Victor would come by afterward, tossing off summaries. "Don't worry, Elena, we made sure to mention your brilliance." He'd smile, but his eyes slid past me, already moving on to the next thing. Daniel was gentler about it. "You know how investors are," he'd murmur as we curled up in bed. "They're old school. They expect a certain front. Let me play that part. It's just optics." He kissed my forehead, the way he always did when he wanted me to stop asking questions. And when the first stack of papers appeared in front of me, temporary adjustments, Daniel called them, I hesitated. Legal language I didn't fully understand filled page after page. "It's just to reassure them," he said, his tone calm, practiced. "They want clarity and ownership while we scale. We'll fix it later, when everything's stable." I remember my pen hovering, my gut twisting. Something in me whispered this isn't right. But then he covered my hand with his his wedding ring pressing against my skin, and whispered, "Trust me, I'm protecting you." So I signed, because he was my husband, because I still wanted to believe that we were on the same team. Weeks bled into months. The company grew noisier, faster, more distant from me. I was still there, sketching, tinkering, dreaming, but always at the margins. Every time I asked about next steps, Daniel would smile, patient and patronizing. "Don't worry, sweetheart. Your brilliance got us here. Let us take it from here." The cracks widened when Claire called. Claire had been my best friend since MIT, sharp-eyed and never fooled by charm. One night, she sent me a link, a public filing, the official record of ownership. I opened it, my chest tightening with each line. Daniel Hayes. Victor Lang. No mention of me. My name gone. I confronted Daniel that night, the document shaking in my hand. "What is this? Where am I?" He didn't flinch. He poured himself a drink, swirling the ice lazily, as if I'd asked about the weather. "It's cleaner this way," he said. "Cleaner?" My voice cracked. "You erased me." He set the glass down, finally meeting my eyes with that calm, chilling certainty that made my stomach drop. "Elena, you're not built for this. You're too soft. I saved you from getting crushed." His words hit harder than any slap. Too soft. As if the nights I spent hunched over prototypes, the burns on my hands, the notebooks filled with my designs meant nothing. As if he'd been doing me a favor by cutting me out of my own creation. I stood there, silent, the truth sinking like ice into my veins. It wasn't just business theft. It was personal erasure. My husband hadn't just stolen my work. He had stolen my place in the story, rewriting it as if I had never existed. And I let him. Because I trusted him. Because I wanted to believe. That night, as I lay awake beside him, his breathing slow and even, I realized the most dangerous betrayals don't come from enemies. They come from the ones who swear they're protecting you. The gala glittered like something out of a movie. Crystal chandeliers spilled light across a ballroom lined with velvet drapes, every table draped in gold and silver. Waiters weaved through the crowd with champagne flutes, and the hum of laughter and camera shutters filled the air. Daniel and Victor stood at the center of it all, tuxedos sharp, smiles sharper. Their names echoed from the stage, their invention hailed as the kind of breakthrough that would change lives. Reporters swarmed them, pens and microphones lifted like offerings. And me? I stood a few feet back, one of 100 women in evening gowns, invisible among the sequins and silk. My chest tightened with each flash of the cameras. I remembered the nights bent over my kitchen counter, soldering pieces until my fingers burned, while Daniel and Victor dropped by to check progress and raid the fridge. I remembered sketching ideas on napkins when inspiration hit mid-conversation. Yet here, now, in this ballroom of applause and champagne, I was a ghost. The reporter's question cut through the noise. "Daniel, who inspired you most on this journey?" I held my breath. Just one word. Just my name. That was all it would take to remind the world that I existed. Daniel's face glowed under the lights. He clapped a hand on Victor's shoulder and said, "Victor, my brother in all but blood. None of this would be possible without him." The crowd cheered. Cameras flashed. Victor smirked, soaking in the applause like sunlight. My name never crossed Daniel's lips. Not even a flicker of acknowledgement. The sting was sharp, hot, but beneath it was something colder and understanding. This wasn't oversight. This was erasure, deliberate and absolute. Claire was at my side, her hand finding mine, fingers pressing tight. She leaned close, her whisper almost drowned by the applause. "Don't give them this moment. Save your fire." I nodded, though my throat burned with unshed words. If I spoke, if I screamed, I'd only give them what they wanted. The picture of me unraveling, the confirmation that I wasn't strong enough to stand here. So instead I slipped away, past the laughter, past the gilded doors, into the cool night. The taxi smelled faintly of leather and cigarettes. I slid into the back seat and gave my address, my voice barely audible. Manhattan's neon lights streaked across the window as we pulled into traffic, colors blurring into long ribbons of red, blue, and gold. I caught my reflection in the glass. Pale face, dark eyes, lips pressed thin. For a moment, I didn't recognize her. The woman who had trusted so blindly, who had signed papers without reading, who had clapped at her own erasure. Grief pressed hard against my ribs, but behind it, sharper, was steel. Every flashbulb, every false smile in that ballroom had stripped away the last of my illusions. The city roared outside. The horns, the sirens, the endless thrum of life. And in that noise, I made my vow. The night they toasted their success was the night I stopped being their victim. I became their reckoning. I didn't announce my decision. No slammed doors, no parting speeches. When you've been erased, the best revenge begins in silence. I told Daniel I needed space, that a consulting opportunity had come up in Chicago, something to keep me busy, while he and Victor handled the real work in New York. He nodded absently, barely looking up from his phone. To him, it was just another sign that I was retreating into irrelevance. That blindness was my greatest gift. Chicago was cold when I arrived, both in weather and in how it felt to start over with nothing but a few suitcases and notebooks of sketches. But I had more than they thought I did. I had my mind, my grit, and most importantly, I had people who still believed in me. Claire was my anchor. She flew out that first weekend, helping me unpack boxes in my tiny apartment overlooking the L tracks. She spread my sketches across the table, tapped her finger against one design and said, "This is better than what they've got. Build it. Prove them wrong."
So I did.
Quietly. I started by reaching out to the people Daniel and Victor had dismissed as second-rate. The young engineer they'd mocked for being too idealistic, the lab tech who'd been ignored at every meeting, the analyst whose reports were buried because they didn't fit the narrative. I told them my story, not the polished version Daniel would have spun, but the truth. I'd been cut out. And I wasn't asking them to save me. I was asking them to build something better with me. To my surprise, they said yes. Maybe it was loyalty. Maybe it was spite against Daniel's arrogance. Maybe it was the simple human desire to matter. But one by one, they joined me, and my small loft office grew louder, warmer, more alive than any sterile Manhattan boardroom I'd ever sat in. By day, I pitched myself as a consultant, bland enough to avoid suspicion, just another freelancer trying to make ends meet. By night, we worked under flickering lamps, soldering wires, refining code, testing prototypes until dawn. It wasn't glamorous. The radiator clanked like it was on its last breath, and the smell of burnt coffee clung to everything. But it was ours. Every late night, every breakthrough, every failure we pushed through together, it belonged to us, not to Daniel, not to Victor. Meanwhile, Claire, always 2 steps ahead, helped me squirrel away every scrap of evidence I'd quietly collected over the years. Receipts of Daniel's business expenses that funded vacations and jewelry. Emails Victor sent promising returns from phantom accounts. A trail of arrogance and greed, laid out like breadcrumbs. I kept it all locked away, labeled and dated, each file a seed waiting to sprout.
Not yet.
Timing was everything. A mentor from MIT, Dr. Kensington, still believed in me too. He connected me with angel investors, quiet money, the kind that didn't need headlines, only results. They gave me just enough to keep the lights on, and with that, the dream they tried to bury began to breathe again. I remember one night in particular. Snow was piling against the windows, the city muffled and white. I sat at the workbench, blueprints spread in front of me, the hum of my small team tinkering in the background. For the first time since that conference room betrayal, I felt steady again. Not whole, not healed, but focused. Humiliation had sharpened into something else. Strategy. Patience. Resolve. Daniel and Victor thought they had buried me under their empire. What they didn't see was that in the dark, I was planting roots. The greatest mistake they ever made wasn't cutting me out. It was underestimating what I could build once I was free of them. People think revenge arrives with fireworks, that it storms into a room with shouting, broken glass, and slammed doors. But I learned something different. Real revenge is paperwork. its signatures, its silence. By the time my father-in-law's old Rolex ticked past midnight one winter evening in Chicago, the fuse was already lit. I remember sitting in my loft office, a stack of files spread across the table, the snow outside falling in thick, soundless drifts. Claire sat across from me, laptop open, glasses perched on her nose as she double-checked attachments. Every email, every scanned receipt, every offshore routing slip was ready. Years of greed, arrogance, and sloppy entitlement cataloged neatly in folders. "Are you sure you're ready?" she asked. I looked at her, then down at the glowing cursor hovering over send. My hands didn't even tremble. "I've been ready since Manhattan," I said. And with one click, the reports were gone, forwarded to the SEC, the IRS, and the Department of Justice. My silence finally had a voice. The next phase was even sweeter. While Daniel and Victor were busy clinking champagne glasses at some Manhattan steakhouse, bragging to investors about the next big leap, my team and I in Chicago were already finalizing hospital contracts. Our prototype was sleeker, cheaper, safer. We had outpaced them quietly, efficiently, with none of their theatrics. I still remember the first time our device shipped out to a small clinic in Ohio. The box looked so ordinary, brown cardboard, a printed label, but I stared at it like it was gold. It was proof. Proof that they hadn't stolen my gift, my fire, or my future. Meanwhile, the empire they thought untouchable was already showing cracks. A junior accountant had noticed irregularities. A supplier had whispered to a reporter. Small tremors, almost invisible, but I knew the quake was coming. Back in New York, Daniel would call me sometimes. Casual check-ins, perfunctory, "How's Chicago treating you?" questions, his tone dripping with that condescending cheer he always used when he thought he was managing me. I played along. Busy but good. Nothing glamorous. If he noticed the faint edge in my voice, he ignored it. Why wouldn't he? In his mind, I was already erased. Victor, on the other hand, sent a single email one night. "Hope you're staying out of trouble." No greeting. No sign-off.
Just that.
I didn't reply. His paranoia was my confirmation. I was closer than he realized. And so I lived in two worlds at once. In Chicago, the long nights, the coffee-fueled breakthroughs, the laughter of my small, hungry team who believed in what we were building. In New York, Daniel and Victor's glittering empire, their awards, their interviews, their smug certainty. They thought they had buried me in silence. What they didn't know was that I had been digging under their foundation the entire time. I never gloated, never tipped my hand. I let them celebrate, let them believe. Because the higher you let someone climb, the harder gravity does the rest. And all the while, the investigations I'd sparked began moving. Quietly, methodically, like gears turning in some vast machine. I'd wake up some mornings with an odd, almost serene smile. Because I knew what was coming. And I knew they didn't. Revenge doesn't roar. Sometimes it whispers through paperwork and signatures, waiting for the right moment to detonate. The collapse didn't arrive like a thunderclap. It crept in like a draft under a locked door, quiet at first, then impossible to ignore. It started with whispers. A leak to the press. An article buried halfway down the Wall Street Journal's homepage. Sterling Medical under review for financial irregularities. That was the name Daniel and Victor had chosen for the company, grand, prestigious, meant to sound like legacy wealth. They laughed it off, of course. At least that's what Claire told me when she read aloud snippets of their quotes in the follow-ups. "Baseless smear campaign," Victor had said. "Competitors jealous of our success," Daniel had added. But arrogance doesn't plug cracks, it widens them. A week later, the cracks became headlines. FBI vans parked outside their Manhattan offices. Cameras lined the sidewalks as agents in Navy windbreakers hauled out boxes, hard drives, and file cabinets. Investors jostled reporters in the lobby, demanding answers. Some shouted Daniel's name. He didn't appear. I wasn't there, of course. But I didn't need to be. The media delivered every angle, live broadcasts, photos splashed across morning papers. Claire and I sat on the couch in my Chicago loft, coffee mugs in hand, watching the feeds. Look at Victor's face, Claire said, pointing at the television. There he was, caught mid-step as he tried to shove past reporters, eyes wide, jaw clenched, sweat blooming under his collar. A man who'd built his life on control suddenly stripped of it. Daniel, ever the performer, tried to spin. He stood at the podium of a hastily called press conference, hair slicked, tie perfect, voice steady. We will cooperate fully with authorities. These allegations are nothing but distractions. But his eyes gave him away. I knew those eyes. I had once believed them. Now, they were the eyes of a drowning man insisting he could swim. The real blow landed 2 weeks later at the Sterling Foundation Gala in Boston. Their crowning social event, the one Daniel's mother curated with obsessive care, the one that pulled in senators, CEOs, and donors eager to brush shoulders with power. The ballroom shimmered that night. Crystal chandeliers, champagne fountains, gowns that cost more than most people's annual salary. Daniel and Victor stood at the center, tuxedos crisp, their smiles rehearsed. And then, like a lightning strike, the story broke. Phones buzzed across the tables, whispers spreading like a contagion. The New York Times had just published the exclusive. Federal indictments filed, counts of wire fraud, tax evasion, and investor deception. I imagine the sound of it in that room, the sudden silence under the chandeliers, the hiss of whispers, the scraping of chairs as people quietly excused themselves, not wanting to be photographed too close to scandal. One reporter, bold enough to slip into the gala, shouted across the ballroom, "Mr. Hayes, do you have any comment on the charges?" Victor's glass shattered against the marble floor. Daniel stormed out, cameras flashing as guests craned to watch. Margaret, his mother, stood frozen near the stage, her perfect composure cracking into something raw and stunned. I wasn't there. I didn't need to be. Claire and I were in Chicago again, wine glasses in hand, watching the chaos unfold on the evening news. She laughed once, a sharp, incredulous laugh, as the footage rolled. I didn't laugh. I only watched. Quiet, steady, satisfied. Their empire crumbled in real time. Stocks plummeted, investors fled, hospitals canceled contracts, and allies melted away like snow in April. And my company? The so-called Dreamers Experiment I'd built from scratch in Chicago? It was soaring. Contracts signed. Hospitals praising our reliability. Engineers thriving in the culture Daniel and Victor had dismissed as second-rate. The world saw headlines, scandals, and collapse. I saw something else. I saw justice in motion. And I didn't need to gloat. Watching it unfold from a distance, with Claire at my side, was enough. At 42, I live a life that looks nothing like the one Daniel once promised me, and everything like the one I promised myself. Chicago became home. My company thrives. The engineers who were once overlooked are now leaders in their field. Our products save lives, and our team knows who built the foundation of our success. My children grow up surrounded not by hollow luxury, but by proof that resilience can be inherited. Sometimes late at night, I still stumble across their names in the news. Victor's trial dragged on for months before he fled to Europe, leaving investors and lawyers to clean up his mess. Daniel stayed stateside, clinging to appeals, his family's name no longer an asset but a punchline in the business pages. Margaret Hayes, once the queen of Manhattan galas, hasn't hosted in years. Their world shrank. Mine expanded. And then came the airport. Logan, Boston, a late-night layover on my way back from a speaking engagement at MIT. I was in line for coffee when I heard the voice. Rougher now, older, tinged with desperation, but familiar enough to stop me cold. I turned. Daniel stood there. His once perfect suit was creased, his tie crooked, his eyes ringed in shadows. For a moment, he looked like any tired traveler. Then he saw me. "Elena," he said, voice low, almost pleading. I raised my cup slightly, a wordless acknowledgement. I could have walked away. I nearly did. But he stepped closer, his expression twisting. "You destroyed me," he muttered. Not a question. An accusation. The words should have stung. Once upon a time they would have. But standing there, under the flat airport lights, surrounded by strangers and the hum of announcements, all I felt was clarity. I set down my cup and met his eyes. "No, Daniel," I said softly, firmly. "You destroyed yourself." I just refused to be erased. For a beat, he had no answer. His mouth opened, then closed. He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him, not the confident man who once dazzled me, not the polished innovator who stole my work, but a hollow echo of both. I picked up my coffee, turned, and walked away. Not hurried, not triumphant, just steady. They thought betrayal would silence me. Instead, it sharpened me. It taught me patience, calculation, and the value of walking away whole. Sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't shouting your victory, it's living so fully that the ones who tried to bury you are left choking on the dust you left behind.